Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into a story, one that's full of history and tension and even colonial meddling. We're going to be
Mm,
looking at the Kukis in Northeast India.
okay.
And, I've got to admit, even I'm a little lost on this one. I was looking at all these sources you sent over about why they're seen as unwelcome in certain areas.
hmm
And
Yeah.
I think we need to unpack this together. What do you think?
Well, I think you're right. It's a story with a lot of layers to it.
Hmm.
And it's easy to get kind of caught up in the headlines without really having a solid understanding of who we're even talking about.
Right.
So I think before we jump into, the why of it all, maybe we need to start with just who are the cookies, you know?
I was just thinking that. When I hear
Right.
cookies, I immediately think of those headlines about the
Yeah.
clashes and the conflicts.
Right.
But who are they beyond that? What's their story?
Well, the Kukis are an ethnic group. Their roots kind of go back to the Tibeto-Burman lineage, and their communities are actually pretty scattered. You'll find them in parts of India like Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, Assam, but also across the border in Myanmar and Bangladesh.
Oh, wow.
They're known for their warrior traditions, their adaptability, and they have a really strong sense of cultural identity. You can almost picture them as this people with a tapestry woven from strength and resilience and a deep connection to their heritage.
That's a great way to put it. It makes the idea of them being unwelcome seem even more jarring when you put it that
Yeah.
way. You've got this image of this vibrant people with this rich history. What happened?
Right.
These sources seem to point to a past with a lot of migration and land disputes. Could that be at the root of the tension?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a significant piece of the puzzle here. For centuries, there's been this kind of movement of Kuki people, particularly from Myanmar into Northeast India.
Okay.
And it's led to a lot of friction with the communities that were already there.
Right.
You can imagine how people might feel when others arrive and start laying claim to land and resources that they've, always seen as theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see how that would lead to resentment, especially when land is so tied to identity and survival.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing the British colonial period probably didn't help smooth things over, did it?
It's almost like pouring fuel on a fire.
Yeah.
The British had this policy of resettling the Kukis,
Oh, wow.
and often they were placing them right in areas that were already inhabited by Naga and Mighty groups. It's like they were almost deliberately setting the stage for conflict by exacerbating those existing territorial disputes.
So are we talking about like a slow burn over generations then?
Yeah.
A buildup of resentment that eventually boiled over? Because some of these sources mention those specific clashes, particularly those Kuki-Naga clashes back in the 1990s.
Yeah, and those clashes in the 90s are really a stark example of just how deep these tensions run.
Yeah.
Thousands of people were displaced, lives lost, and it was all fueled by that history of those territorial disputes. The Naga nationalist group, the NSCN, saw the Kukis as encroaching on what they considered their ancestral land.
Right.
On the other side, you had the Kukis accusing the Nagas of essentially trying to wipe them out.
That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Thousands of people forced from their homes, lives uprooted. I mean, it makes you think about the psychological impact of that kind of displacement. The trauma that echoes through generations.
Absolutely, it's a wound that festers.
Yeah.
And those wounds, they fuel anger and resentment.
And from what I've read, it seems like Manipur has been a real focal point for a lot of these tensions too, hasn't it?
It really has. It's like Manipur is almost like a microcosm of that larger conflict. You have
Yeah.
the Maites, who are the dominant group in the valley, clashing with the Kukis, who primarily inhabit the hills. The Maites, they voiced concerns about, the influx of Kukis from Myanmar. They're worried about demographics and drug-related issues.
Right.
And then on the flip side, you have the Kukis claiming that they're being persecuted just for who they are.
It's just heartbreaking to see this cycle of accusation and violence repeating itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's the 2023 Manipur violence, which really brought this conflict to the forefront, didn't it?
Yeah, the 2023 violence was a really devastating reminder of just how deeply rooted these tensions are. Hundreds killed, thousands displaced.
That's just awful.
Yeah, it's a stark wake-up call. But I think if we really want to try to find some sort of solution, we need to look beyond the violence and really understand what's driving this, modern narrative.
Okay.
What are the factors that continue to fuel this perception of Kukis as unwelcome?
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and miss the nuances.
Exactly.
So let's dive into that. From what I've gathered, one of the main accusations is that the Kukis, particularly those coming from Myanmar, are essentially being seen as illegal immigrants.
Yeah, that's a core part of the narrative that you hear from those who oppose the Kukis. The argument is that they don't belong, that they're encroaching on land that's meant for the indigenous tribes.
Right.
They paint this picture of the Kukis as outsiders coming to take what isn't theirs.
But the Kukis themselves, they push back against that, right?
They do.
Claiming that they've actually been in the region for centuries.
Exactly.
So how do we even unpack this question of, who truly belongs? Who gets to decide who's native and who's not?
That's where things get really complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's no simple answer.
Right.
You've got historical migrations layered on top of pre-colonial realities.
Right.
And then you've got the British coming in and redrawing all the boundaries, which just muddies the waters even further.
Yeah. So it's not just about where you were born, but also about this sense of belonging, right?
Exactly.
A connection to the land that goes back generations.
It's a sense of identity.
And speaking of belonging, that whole issue of autonomy and identity politics seems to be a major sticking point too, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. The Kuki demand for a separate homeland within Manipur and Nagaland has really stoked the flames,
Yeah.
Other communities, they see this as a threat, as a fracturing of their land.
Yeah.
And it really reinforces this whole idea of the Kukis as outsiders with their own agenda. It feeds into this fear of losing what's theirs.
It's like this tangled weld of history, identity, and politics all converging on this one issue.
It really is.
And sadly, it seems like those allegations of involvement in the drug trade have kind of added another layer of complexity to this whole mix.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic to talk about, but it's there.
Right.
Some Kukis have been accused of being involved in the drug trade, particularly in those poppy-growing regions of Manipur.
Yeah.
And even though it's important to remember that that doesn't apply to the entire community, those accusations definitely contribute to a negative perception.
Yeah, it's like a brushstroke that paints the whole picture, even though it might not reflect the whole truth. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the history, the conflicts, the accusations.
Right.
And honestly, it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
We've laid the groundwork.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to explore here. I think to really understand why the Kukis are seen as unwelcome, we need to look at both sides of the coin.
Sure.
We can't just ignore the contributions that they've made to the region. We've got to look at the complexities that often get lost in the heat of the conflict.
You know what? That's a perfect place to pause, I think.
Okay.
We've established the historical context. We've talked about the major conflicts and some of the present-day issues that fuel that perception of the Kukis as unwelcome.
Right.
But I think we need to dig a little deeper, don't you?
I think so, yeah. There's more to the story than just the conflict and the accusations. The Kukis are a part of the fabric of Northeast India, and understanding their contributions is vital for us to get a complete picture.
I'm ready when you are.
All right, let's dive back in. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about some of the, those negative perceptions surrounding the Kukis in Northeast India.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that, there's always more to the story than that.
Absolutely. We can't just focus on the conflicts and the accusations without acknowledging the positive side, too.
Yeah.
What about the Kukis' contributions to the region? I mean, these sources highlight some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's like looking at a tapestry and only seeing those dark threads,
Right.
The Kukis have this long and rich history in Northeast India, and they've made some really significant contributions to the region's culture, economy, and even its defense.
Okay, so let's pull on those brighter threads for a bit then.
Yeah.
What are some examples of those contributions? I'm really curious to hear more about this.
Well, one striking example is their service in the Indian Army. Imagine the internal conflict for a Kuki person choosing to serve in the very army that some see as, an instrument of their oppression.
Yeah.
It really highlights their commitment to India as a whole, despite facing these really difficult challenges.
That's a really powerful point. It challenges that whole outsider narrative, doesn't it?
It does.
It shows that they're invested in the future of India as a whole.
Yeah.
What about in other areas? What about their cultural contributions?
Oh, their cultural contributions are woven into the fabric of Northeast India.
Okay.
Their music, their dance, their arts and crafts, it all adds to this really vibrant cultural tapestry of the region.
Yeah.
To disregard all of that would be like ripping out a whole section of this beautiful artwork.
It's a good reminder that we're not just talking about abstract political issues here.
Right.
We're talking about real people with families and traditions and this deep connection to their heritage.
Exactly. And to really fully grasp the complexities of the Kukis situation, we have to understand that the conflicts that we've been discussing, they're not solely about ethnicity.
Right.
There's this whole web of other factors at play, things like political power struggles and land ownership issues to the impact of government policies. It's like a knot that's been tightened over centuries.
So it's about acknowledging that this isn't a black and white situation.
Right.
There are so many shades of gray here, so many different perspectives and experiences, even within the cookie community itself.
Precisely. Different Kuki groups have different histories, different experiences in the region.
Of course.
Some may have arrived more recently, others have been there for generations. Their relationships with other communities, they vary based on location, on shared history, on economic circumstances. To paint them all with one brush would be a huge oversimplification.
Yeah, it seems like every time we peel back a layer of this story, we uncover even more nuance and complexity.
We do.
It's a far cry from that simple, unwelcome label that gets thrown around so much.
And that's really the key takeaway here. We
Right.
need to move beyond those simplistic labels and generalizations and really delve into those nuances. Otherwise, we risk perpetuating those harmful stereotypes and just deepening those divides even further.
I couldn't agree more. It's through understanding those nuances, those individual stories and experiences, that I think we can begin to see the possibility of some common ground
Absolutely.
and maybe even chart a path towards some kind of reconciliation.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about recognizing that shared humanity.
Yeah.
Those common threads that bind us despite all of our differences. And it's through that recognition that we can start to maybe unravel those knots that have tied this region in conflict for so long.
It's a hopeful thought,
hmm
but realistically, what does that path forward even look like?
Right.
What are the steps that can lead us toward a lasting peace and reconciliation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it deserves its own deep dive. Yeah.
It's one thing to understand the past and the present, but how do we apply that knowledge to actually create a more hopeful future?
Okay. I think we need to take another pause here.
Okay.
We've explored the contributions of the Kukis. We've talked about the complexities of their situation and the need for a more nuanced understanding.
Right.
But I think the big question remains, what's next?
Exactly. How do we move beyond this cycle of accusation and violence and actually create a more inclusive and harmonious society for all communities in Northeast India? That's the challenge, and that's what we'll explore when we come back.
Wow, we've really journeyed through a lot, haven't we? We've gone from the depths of history through all these tangled conflicts and even glimpsed some of those moments of hope and resilience in the Kuki story.
We have.
It's clear that this situation needs more than just, some quick fixes, right?
Right.
It really calls for a deep understanding of all those nuances and a commitment to actually finding lasting solutions.
It's like trying to untangle this, this massive knot.
There's no magic solution that's going to make all the tension and mistrust disappear overnight. It's going to take a whole toolkit of approaches. We need to address those deep-rooted historical grievances, the power dynamics, the economic disparities that really fuel these conflicts.
So where do we even begin with something this complex? It just feels like there's so much anger and resentment on all sides. How do we even start a conversation when those emotions are so raw?
Yeah, it's not going to be easy. But I think a crucial first step is simply creating those spaces for open and honest dialogue. Imagine communities coming together, sharing their perspectives, and truly listening to each other's stories without judgment. It's about acknowledging the pain and suffering that these conflicts have caused on all sides.
That sounds amazing in theory, but honestly, it feels a bit idealistic. How do we actually get people to the table when there's so much distrust?
I think it starts with recognizing those historical injustices, the violence, the displacement that have left such deep scars on everyone involved. We need a commitment to truth and reconciliation. Maybe that involves truth commissions, public apologies, or some other way of acknowledging the wrongs of the past. It's about creating a foundation of empathy and understanding.
Yeah, empathy seems key, but it can't just stop there, can it?
Mm-hmm.
What about those economic disparities that we talked about? It seems like when certain communities are left behind, it just creates this breeding ground for resentment and conflict.
Absolutely. We need to invest in economic development that actually benefits all communities in the region. Equal access to education, healthcare, job opportunities. When people feel like they have a stake in the future, they're less likely to resort to violence.
So it's about moving away from this, This idea of competition for scarce resources and really creating this sense of shared prosperity,
Exactly.
making sure everyone feels like they have the chance to thrive.
Right. But we also can't forget about the institutions that are supposed to be upholding fairness and
Yeah.
justice. We need to strengthen the rule of law, make sure that justice is served fairly and impartially. If people feel like the system is rigged against them, they're more likely to just take matters into their own hands.
That makes a lot of sense. A functioning legal system where everyone feels protected and respected, that's crucial. But what about those really deeply ingrained stereotypes and prejudices? How do we bridge that gap in understanding?
I think education and cultural exchange programs could play a huge role there.
Hmm.
Imagine opportunities for people to really learn about each other's cultures and traditions and perspectives. When you understand someone, it's much harder to demonize them.
It sounds like we're talking about a really long-term, multifaceted commitment here. Education, dialogue, economic development, strengthening institutions. It's a tall order, but is it the only way to create a future where all these communities in Northeast India can truly coexist peacefully?
I think you've summed it up perfectly. It is a challenging path, but I believe it's a path towards hope. And I think the key takeaway for our listeners is that this kooky situation in Northeast India, it's so much more than just a headline. It's about really understanding the complexities, those human stories that are woven into this historical tapestry.
And by understanding those complexities, by recognizing that shared humanity beneath all the conflict, maybe, just maybe, we can start to weave a new tapestry.
I like that.
One that's filled with, threads of peace and understanding and hope. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me, and I hope our listeners feel the same.
I would agree. And as we wrap up here, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought. What role can each of us play in promoting understanding, empathy, and reconciliation? Not just in Northeast India, but in all those places around the world where conflict and division threaten to tear communities apart.
That's a powerful question to ponder. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has encouraged you to keep exploring and learning and engaging in those conversations that really contribute to a more peaceful and just world for everyone.